Hello, I'm Louis Meyers, and welcome to Meet the Author, where we have with us on Zoom from his workplace in Nashville, Tennessee, today, Mr. Ganesh Sitaraman, who's going to be talking about his 2023 book, Why Flying is Miserable and How to Fix It. Briefly, Mr. Sitaraman attended Harvard as an undergraduate, went to Cambridge University in England for a master's degree in political thought, returned to Harvard where he got his law degree, and was an editor of the Harvard Law Review. He has subsequently worked as a senior advisor to Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts during her Senate and presidential campaigns, and a senior counsel in her time in the Senate. He is currently the director of Vanderbilt University's Policy Accelerator for Political Economy and Regulation. Mr. Sitaraman, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Why don't we just start by telling us, if you would, briefly, why it was you decided to focus on the airlines and what's going on in the airline industry?
Well, I'm somebody who has traveled a lot for work. I give talks around the country, I go to conferences, and then obviously sometimes for fun and pleasure too. And like a lot of people who travel, I've had my fair share of unfortunate and miserable experiences while flying. And that combined with the moment of COVID-19, where you had these airlines coming to Congress asking for huge amounts of money in taxpayer support. And then a year later, after they took all this money, there being thousands of flight cancellations and delays and all of these problems in the industry. And it struck me at that moment that, people, not just me, might be interested in, why is this happening? Why is it that we keep having this system where airlines are doing great sometimes and then there's a big bust and they come running for bailouts? Why is it that we experience this industry as one with less competition, with more consolidation, and with a kind of more miserable experience? And as someone who's a law professor, I actually have something to say about that, because a lot of my research has been about how regulation works and doesn't, and how we've regulated and deregulated in a lot of different industries over American history. And I've written a book, a textbook on regulation about different infrastructure sectors. And as part of that, I've done a lot of research into the airline industry. And it struck me that this was just a place where a large number of people who travel would be interested in knowing, how did we get here to this place where the industry, the experience, and forgive the pun, is just so turbulent.
Why don't you take us now, just very briefly, sketch a history of the commercial airline industry, which you do in the book. You sort of broke it into three segments, I think. Just tell us briefly, what are those segments?
Yeah, so I think there are really three eras in American flying policy and the industry. The first were the early years, really from the Wright brothers until the 1930s. And this is a period in which the federal government, through the post office, is supporting the development of this nascent industry, largely through mail subsidies, which is how we build up the industry in the first place. The second period is from the 1930s, 1938 in particular, until the 1970s, until 1978. And this was a period of regulated competition. And so what happened in the 1930s during the New Deal is that policymakers decided we need an airline industry that is really going to meet a kind of Goldilocks standard. It's going to be competitive, but not so competitive that all the companies go bankrupt or, waste all this capital while building and then have to go under, or where they're going to need bailouts, and not so uncompetitive that it becomes a monopoly or an oligopoly, because that'll also be bad for the public and for consumers. And so we're going to have a system of regulated competition that'll be right in the middle. And they also wanted to serve the whole country, including small cities, medium-sized cities. And so the way they did that was they created this agency, the Civil Aeronautics Board, and it would allocate routes to airlines, tell airlines where you can fly to make sure that every place in the country got some service. Some places they're going to have a high volume, some places are going to be a low volume. it regulated prices so that they wouldn't just charge all the high volume places good prices and charge low volume places really, really high prices that would be unaffordable. And it regulated all the other parts of the industry basically as well. And this system worked pretty well for 40 years. We had more and more people flying. We had prices going down. We had new innovations like the jet and the wide-body jet. And we also had a period in which there weren't failures, right? There weren't really bankruptcies and bailouts that were going on in that part of the mid 20th century. Then we get to the 1970s, and there was really a perfect storm of things going on in this period. There was the oil shocks and a big crisis of inflation. The airlines had just bought a lot of wide-bodied jets, which increased their costs, which meant they wanted higher prices to be able to charge to cover those costs. And people at this time had spent a lot of years arguing as academics that regulation's not so great, and maybe what we should do is let open competition win the day. And so they pitched Congress to basically say, if we let airlines fly wherever they want, whenever they want, and charge wherever they want, everything will be better. We'll have cheaper prices, more competition, and without really any downsides. So Congress bought that pitch because it was a good pitch, and deregulated the industry in 1978. And really where I think we've been since then is actually a period of what I might call something like more like monopolistic capitalism or exploitation in a way. It's a period of consolidation and concentration that has meant more and more power to airlines, and less attentiveness to what the interests of the public are. And so right after deregulation, you get way more competition. New entrants come in, they're charging low prices, and people think this has been highly successful. But then the big airlines fight back in this like Hunger Games competition, and they predatory price the small airlines out of business in some cases. There's a lot of mergers, a lot of bankruptcies. And by the end of the 80s, you have the same big airlines as under regulation. They're just now not regulated. And in the meantime, you have a graveyard of airlines that have disappeared. You've had renegotiation of union contracts that are less favorable now to workers. You've had loss of service to a lot of smaller cities. And you've had the restructuring of the whole industry into these giant hubs and all of these cities that are now spokes around the country, serving those hubs. And that's really been the place we've been in, with some tweaks where we've had these boom and bust cycles since then with bailouts and good years, and where we've had lots and lots of mergers over and over with more and more consolidation in the sector. And that's really where I think we are today, is in the kind of least competitive period we've ever had in the history of the airline industry in the United States, with the most consolidation and concentration.
Let's go back to 1978, a critical year. You mentioned economists were thinking that free market would help the airline industry and help passengers. A lot of that was coming out of Chicago and Milton Friedman's economists there. But there was also in Washington, one of the big proponents of this, as you write about in the book, was Senator Edward Kennedy, and one of his chief aides, Stephen Breyer, who would go on to be a Supreme Court justice. Now, these were liberal people who I think probably shared a lot of the same views Senator Warren, for example, does in many ways. And yet at the time, they thought this was a good idea. Why?
Yeah, it's really interesting. At that time, you have liberals, and it's not just Kennedy and Breyer, but also Ralph Nader coming together. And their concern is that the system of airline regulation that we have is really something more like a corrupt cartel, that the government is captured by industry, and that the regulations are serving the industry rather than serving consumers. And, concerns about regulatory capture have been common for a very long time, and they're a serious concern. But there's also this issue that, in some sectors, and I think airlines are one of them, there are sectors that are not inherently going to be very competitive. And I think what they got wrong at the time was thinking that airlines could be a sector that would be as competitive as, opening a restaurant or selling coffee mugs, selling coffee mugs, anything a ceramicist could do. And there could be lots of ceramicists.
Why is it difficult for airlines to be competitive?
Well, I think the challenge in this sector is it's just not like these other businesses because of a number of factors. Number one, scale and network effects really matter a lot. it's really beneficial to be a bigger airline that flies to more places because people want to be able to go to a lot of places and because you can reduce your costs if you have a lot of operations and you concentrate them in a single place. A second challenge, and so that gets you both scale and networks. But the other part of this that we saw with deregulation specifically was, the more flights you have to a certain place, the more appealing it is to people, right? If you can get everywhere with one connection, say if you want to fly through Atlanta on Delta, you can get to hundreds of locations from that one place, Atlanta. That's very valuable. It means through one connection, you can get to a lot of places. You don't have to connect two or three times. Makes it easier for people in some cases. Certainly concentrates the costs. Delta only has to make sure they have all these operations in Atlanta, not in four or five different airports. And so concentration in different ways helps the airlines. The other challenge is that, they really assumed that there weren't significant barriers to entry into the airline industry, but there really are. I mean, you can't just start an airline and start flying from place to place. You have to have a place to land to start. And that place, you can't just land wherever you want, like you can't land on highways. There are cars driving there. And if you can't just land at an airport because if two planes land at the same time, they're going to crash into each other and that would be a disaster. So, you have to coordinate these things, but that means that there's a restriction. There's a certain number of landing slots, there's a certain number of gates, there's a certain number of airports. So we have a limit on these things, which means it is actually hard to get into the business and start doing that, and especially to start doing it at scale.
You write quite a bit in the book about what happened to smaller communities, smaller cities around the country. Let's take Burlington, Vermont, where I'm speaking from, which I think is a classic example of what you write about. Small city, we had one or at most two airlines coming in and out of our relatively small airport. I believe they continued to get bought up by bigger and bigger airlines. We now have American Airlines, which flies predominant routes, and a couple of other airlines as well. But as people in Burlington know, the prices are sky high flying out of here, if you can even find a flight where you need to go. Now that's the situation in cities across the country. How is that different than the way it used to be?
Yeah, what's really interesting to me is the fate of small cities under these two systems. And in the regulated period, what the regulators recognized is that smaller cities are simply not going to have the volume of flights to make them economical for the airlines to be able to serve them at affordable rates. Um, and, so if you think about that, certainly there's just going to be fewer people on any given day flying from Burlington, Vermont, than there are flying out of New York City. New York is just a much bigger city. More people are going to fly. But the challenge is we want people to be able to get to Burlington and from Burlington at an affordable price. And so what the regulators did was they would assign a route to an airline. Say you'd get, New York to Washington, highly trafficked route, or Boston to Washington. And you're probably going to make a lot of money on that route. But now you're also going to serve Burlington to New York or Burlington to Boston or Burlington to somewhere. And you may make less money or none, may lose money on that route. But we're going to give you both, and you have to do it. It's a duty to serve because we believe that the country, in our gigantic country, should all have service, so that we can be stitched together as one nation. And and the second thing they did is they set prices. And so you couldn't just charge the market going rate for the Burlington flight because that would be exorbitantly expensive if there's only one or two people on a flight, or sometimes that might be the case, or if it's just a handful or a couple dozen. Um, so instead, they would charge a per mile uh, rate. So, the specific formulas changed over the course of the 20th century, but by the end, the kind of rule of thumb was an equal fares for equal miles kind of principle, which is if you're flying a 500-mile route, you get charged the 500-mile route. And that's true if you're going from big city to big city or big city to small city or small city to small city. And that was a way, so you could sort of think of it like electricity metering. You're getting charged by how many kilowatt hours of electricity you use, not by not by what you're using it for necessarily. And this is the per mile was sort of the similar kind of principle.
Well, that brings up an important point that you talk about in your book, which is Should airlines be considered a utility, and should they be regulated and monitored and allowed to make money in the same ways that utilities are?
Yeah, and I think this is what's really interesting is the 20th century model was a model of airlines as a public utility. And it was a system that wasn't a single public utility, and it wasn't totally public. It was a private set of companies, but the regulatory principles were similar to public utility law, and it was designed to maintain competition in the system. Now, I think the alternatives to that, once you take into account the economies of scale, the network effects, the barriers to entry, all the economic dynamics of the airline industry that tend toward consolidation rather than competition. Um, the other alternatives, if you're going to have a consolidated industry, are non-regulation, in which case you get what we have kind of now, which is unregulated monopolies and oligopolies, which often means higher prices, bad service, not universal service across the country as well, and low resilience in some cases, uh, coupled with very little competition because it's not going to inherently have competition. The other option is you have public airlines, right? You nationalize them and have a publicly run airline system, and some countries have done that as well. But those are really the choices if what you're trying to do is solve some of these fundamental problems.
How has it worked out in the countries that do have national airlines?
And it's a really interesting question. I remember giving a book talk right when the book came out, and one of the first questions I got from someone was framed this way: that the person said, "The best airline I've ever flown on in my life is a state-run, government-run airline." And the worst airline I've ever flown on in my entire life is a government-run airline. So what should we do with that? And I think that's a great question. And what I will say is, there's a few confounding factors that make it really hard and to assess. And I don't think actually framing it as government run or not government run is necessarily the best way to think about it, because I think a lot of these rules matter. You could have a government run airline that only flies to a few big cities in the country, and you still have all the problems of small communities. You could have a government run airline that still charges dynamic prices and surveillance pricing and is charging different people, as high as they can. Well, that's still going to be bad for consumers, right? It's so there's a part of how do we design the rules, not just who owns the airline. But the one thing I'll say is when you see a lot of the countries that have done very well with government run airlines, they tend to be doing international flights and small, think about Singapore Airlines, really a city state. They're not flying within Singapore. Um, when you have a really big country, it's harder to, I think, pull off in some places. But I think there's a second confounding factor, which is, what's the level of government capacity generally, right? If you, again, to take Singapore, if you have a country that has a really well-oiled bureaucracy that works extremely well in, in using state power, probably all the state enterprises are going to be pretty good because the state is really strong and knows how to do things and does it well. If you have places where the state is really corrupt, well, the airline's going to be corrupt too, and it's probably not going to work that well either. So I think some of these things are really, much broader than thinking about airlines particularly.
Here in Burlington, we know that almost any flight you take out of Burlington has to go through a hub, one of these large centralized airports. And you write in your book that while there are certain advantages of that, it also adds to the fragility of the system. Most of us have been stuck on, as you have, at airports with hours and hours of delays because of a problem not at our airport where we are, but at some distant hub, which has now affected thousands of flights throughout the country. So what about hubs? Are they here to stay? What can we do about this?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, the way I think about it always is like, if there's high winds in Dallas or if there's a big storm in Atlanta, you're going to have a cascading effect across the entire country of airlines because of that one place. Because so many flights for the airline connect through there, it impacts everything else they're doing. Um, what do we do about that? Well, I think the answer has to be, if we care about resilience, to deconcentrate the system. Decentralized networks are going to be more resilient if any one node has a problem than a highly centralized system. And to me, the way you do that is, Congress, for example, just to give one idea, And there's probably lots of ways you could do it. But one idea is Congress could just say, we're going to have a cap for the biggest airports in the country on how many flights or percentage of flights a single airline can control. Right now, at some of these big airports, it's 70, 80% or more of the flights are from one airline. And that means there's not only higher prices in that place, but it means that that airline's entire network is heavily dependent on that city. If instead you say, let's say there's 30%, 40% of a cap, well, now you'd have a lot more flights going to a lot more places from a lot more airlines. And even if that means just three airlines or four airlines, each airline would be less dependent on a single city and would also, if it wanted to keep its volume, have to build out some other airports and some other hubs. It would need more hubs, not fewer. And so I think if you, instead of like three mega hubs in the country, you had 12 mini hubs, but we'd have a much more resilient network then.
I'm a physician, and so I'm also, of course, interested in healthcare. And it strikes me that some of the same challenges facing the airline industry and passengers are the same issues that face healthcare and patients, and that includes cost, access, and quality are the three big ones. And in healthcare, consolidation has, which was promised to help all three of those, has done just the opposite in many cases. And it seems like in the airlines, it's been the same problem where this massive consolidation into four major airlines has not really reduced the cost, is not entirely reduced. It's actually made access problems worse in some of the small cities. And, the quality is debatable. We might want to talk about that because, as you note, flying can be miserable. And just in terms of the quality of the experience now and the nickel and diming and just the overall quality that passengers are feeling. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the passenger experience and quality I think of as another kind of casualty of the system, and you can decide what quality is appropriate. I mean, different people might have some amounts of different views about that. But one of the things that we've seen, for example, is just shrinking seat sizes over the years, right? Seats have gotten smaller. They have. And that does make things miserable for people who are taller than we've been before in the kind of grand scheme of history, actually. And that's a place where, of course, it makes sense for the airline to try to squeeze people in more because it means you get another row, you make some more money. But the experience is going to be a lot worse for all of us, and that's really replicated in other ways, right? You think about extra fees for everything, not serving meals on flights, all of these things, they reduce costs for airlines or increase revenues, which is good for them, but makes the experience worse for passengers.
Finally, let's talk about Spirit Airlines for a moment, which is in the news. I think I just saw that they are trying to rise from the dead yet again. They've been through 2 or 3 bankruptcies, and we thought that they were done, but like a vampire, they keep getting back up. And there's news today that they may try and come out of bankruptcy again and be purchased by some organization in Texas. When you see an airline like Spirit Airlines struggling like this, what does it tell you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, when you think about these airlines, I think there's a couple of things potentially that are going on here. Um, Number one, which I think is the hardest to make an assessment of as an outsider, is it just being run well or is it being run poorly? Right? Any given business can be run badly or can be run well. And I don't really have a sense in the Spirit case. I'm not going to pass judgment on whether the executives did a good job or bad job. There are people in the news who write about why they think Spirit's executives have done a bad job or not. But just as an example, when people talk about Spirit merging, they had some opportunities to merge with Frontier, for example. They didn't take that. Is that a management problem? You might say yes. You might also say management thought they had a strategy that they didn't need to merge. That could have been a reasonable mistake or an unreasonable mistake. But that's kind of one category. To me, though, the really interesting thing is not was Spirit run badly or well, which it might have been. It's Why is it that over and over and over and over again, we see low cost, ultra low cost, or even big mainline carriers needing to merge with each other and wanting to merge with each other or otherwise going bankrupt? And that's not just been about Spirit. That's been, you could once fly an airline called AirTran. You can't fly it anymore. They merged with Southwest. You could once fly Continental. That doesn't exist anymore. Northwest Airlines doesn't exist anymore. I mean, we could list the dozens of airlines that don't exist anymore. Why did they all feel the need to merge, or why did they go bankrupt, right? And that's what happened to them. They all disappeared. And to me, that's again about these fundamental dynamics of this industry, which is this is not an industry that's going to be like, restaurants or something where there's going to be dozens and dozens of competitors all operating successfully. And in fact, that is what the people who were pushing deregulation in 1978 thought. They pitched that you were going to have dozens, maybe even hundreds of airlines that would exist in a competitive landscape. Um, the fundamentals of this industry don't lead to that. What they lead to is a very small number of airlines that even then feel the need to merge. And you probably saw the other day, you know, Scott Kirby, the head of United, saying maybe we should merge with American. I mean, that's a merger of two mega huge airlines, right? So it's not just the low cost carriers. The airlines are constantly talking about wanting to merge with each other. And so to me, that's about fundamental dynamics, not necessarily about whether one set of management team was doing a good job or not.
We have had a remarkably safe airline industry, given all the factors that can go wrong in the air. Would you worry, let's say we had 100 airlines, obviously many of them are going to be much smaller. Would you worry about safety, the quality of the pilots, the quality of the planes? I know that the FAA is supposed to oversee that, but would you worry?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to think about here. Number one is what you said, just what's the number and the volume, right? And I think there's a concern that if you have too many, maybe there's less oversight, less ability to manage and to license airlines and make sure they have the right kinds of safety procedures and so on. I do think that's a concern at some level, but I don't think it's really a concern going from, four airlines to eight or to 10. We had 10 airlines that were all pretty big, for a large chunk of American history, of the flying history that I've described here. And that's not a kind of unsafe number. So I do think we could have a lot more airlines, a lot more competition, without getting to a point where maybe there would be some greater concerns. But the second part is I do think part of the story here is also what are we doing in terms of public investment into the things that make flying safe, and into the infrastructure we need. So, do we have enough air traffic controllers and a good pipeline of air traffic controllers? Do we have good infrastructure at our airports on the ground in terms of our technologies that we're using, that make the process safer, and increasingly safer over time, rather than letting it go stagnant, which is, functionally making it less safe over time? How do we do that and improve? And a part of that story is you got to pay for it. If you want good infrastructure, there's got to be money for it and you have to pay for it. And I think part of our story has also been an unwillingness in the last, half century almost, to embrace the idea that good public services are actually worth having and that it's worth paying taxes for them and we should have them. And so this kind of austerity, let's cut the government, let's cut all the public spending, does actually mean you get worse infrastructure, and that can mean less safe infrastructure too.
Yeah. Well, in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to give you free rein to make you the commissioner or over the secretary of airline industry. Tell me the first three things you're going to do.
Well, it's a great question. Let me give you kind of my top three that are short of the really bold ideas that we talked about earlier. Should you regulate it as a public utility? Should you do nationalization? I think three, smaller ideas, but that I think would be transformative. Number one, to address the problem we talked about small cities, I think we should have a kind of NFL draft for small cities, in which every airline, the airlines are like the teams, the cities are like the players. And the big airlines, if you're above a certain size, you've got to pick cities to serve, and you've got to serve them a certain amount of frequency at an affordable rate. Just to make sure that we are providing service to all the different places around the country that don't get it or don't get it at an affordable price. That's kind of number one. Number two is to address the problems of bailouts and this boom and bust cycle that we keep seeing, where they have high profits in some years and then are running to Congress asking taxpayers for money in other years. I think we should have a kind of rainy day fund for airlines. So they're required in their profitable years to pay into. And then that can be drawn down from when there's a big crisis and they need the support. And then a third idea, just for consumers straight up, easy one. We should have minimum seat sizes. So we stop this regression back down to smaller and smaller seats. And you didn't ask for it, but I'll give you a fourth one too, one more, which is really banning this practice of dynamic surveillance pricing where your prices change on the airline all the time. And I think that's just going to get worse as we get better AI technologies that allow for transforming people's personal information into something that can be customized into a price. I'm worried that that's going to be something people are going to find increasingly problematic and frustrating as the years go on.
Well, I just have one question. Can ESPN broadcast the draft day?
I hope so. I mean, I think that would be pretty fun, right? I think people would watch that.
Yeah, I think they would. Listen, I want to thank you. It's an ongoing story, obviously, and we appreciate your work. We appreciate the book. It's a short book. I will say it punches above its weight because you get a lot of ideas in the course of a fairly short book, so it makes it very readable. And if people want to know more about the airlines and how where we develop problems and where the future may lie, I recommend this book that just came out a couple of years ago. I also happen to love the cover, by the way. So, Mr. Ganesh Sitaraman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Please join us on our next episode of Meet the Author.